Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a big update regarding the Russia-Ukraine situation, with Donald Trump now coming out and calling out Vladimir Putin, saying he's very angry with Putin over Putin's recent comments about Zelensky. You can see Trump says his Russian counterpart's questioning of Vladimir Zelensky's credibility could delay the ceasefire, and it's been this back and forth, this riffraff. If we remember originally, it was Zelensky, because the Russians have been claiming that, well, Zelensky is getting his orders from the European countries in the West and saying that Zelensky was prolonging the war and the situation, making it a never-ending war. But Zelensky was the one that agreed with the United States to the ceasefire. And then a few days later, Putin said he would agree to a ceasefire as well, but he wanted to talk to Trump. So Trump and Putin talked on an hour-long phone call. They didn't come to an agreement. There was a partial ceasefire put in place on infrastructure, but there's not a complete ceasefire at this point. So Donald Trump is getting very angry. Both Zelensky and Putin have made statements about each other as they kind of joust in terms of this political battle. And there's also battles going on in eastern Ukraine. They've kind of picked up recently as the two sides both sense possibly an end to the war, although Putin has made statements recently saying they might just take over all of Ukraine. Ukraine is down men, obviously, now that we are about 3 years into this war, and they are really hurting. And Trump is saying, listen, we've been fair to both Russia and Ukraine, but Trump is being this middleman and saying that, well, they've called me a Russian agent, they've called me all this stuff, it's all fake. And this is why I'm angry at Putin now. He is not playing ball like Zelensky is, and this is just the reality. And Russia has spread some propaganda about Zelensky. There's the idea, well, Zelensky should hold elections during wartime. Obviously, he doesn't want to do that. There's also the idea, and this is kind of recently the more Republican talking point, that Zelensky is prolonging this war and it's going to be a never-ending war. Well, it has to end at some point. Ukraine is going to run out of troops. And the only way to prolong it would be the NATO European involvement, which would be troops from the UK, France. I've kind of taken a more optimistic approach and said, well, listen, that's just done for positional jousting in terms of a peace deal, to let Russia know that Ukraine is not desperate for a peace deal. And if there is no peace deal or no total ceasefire, that there will be additional troops deployed for Ukraine if it comes to that. Because why would Putin really agree to give up anything in negotiations if he can just take over Ukraine, since they've got such a weakened force at this stage in the war? Well, it's because Ukraine still has NATO behind them. And if you want to expand the war, we know Russia's invested a lot into this. They want to get something out of it. Do they really want to fight NATO with a weakened armed forces at this point? I really don't think so. So there's this jousting for it, but Trump is like angry at this point. He's like, listen, we've been very nice and patient with Putin, and we agreed originally to a ceasefire with Zelensky. That's why we started funding them again, and that was part of it, and we were pitching it to Putin, and Putin said, well, look, if we agree to a ceasefire, I want to know where your head's at when it comes to a peace deal, because there's no point of a 1-month ceasefire if the peace deal, if we're way off on the potential peace agreement. And my guess is Russia and Putin are asking for a lot here when it comes to a peace deal in terms of what they require from Ukraine. Now, and it's not necessarily the amount of land that they're getting. Well, that's another thing, because you still have Zelensky saying, we want Crimea back, all this. It's not possible. How would you get Crimea back without NATO troop involvement? Or some crazy sanctions that have already been leveled against Russia that obviously is not affecting them to the point to where they would give up Crimea in return for the sanctions being lifted. We're just not at that point. Or for Russia, it just doesn't matter in terms of their economy. So you can see Trump is very angry. We're going to go through this. Donald Trump has said that he is pissed off with Putin over his approach to a ceasefire in Ukraine, and threatened to levy tariffs on Moscow's oil exports if the Russian leader does not agree to a truce within a month. Donald Trump indicated he would levy 25% to 50% tariff. So this is a threat to Putin based off of Putin's behavior recently and his statements about Zelensky. They've been very hostile, and Zelensky's had some statements about Putin. It's like we're going in the opposite direction when it comes to this peace deal. So Trump is saying, I got to go harder at getting this thing done. And maybe if I threaten Russia with sanctions, it would kind of rein Russia in and get this worked out. I mean, this could all be delays so Russia can get a proper setup in terms of where they want their armies positioned for a peace deal, basically give themselves more advantageous securities in terms of the areas that they currently have when it comes to, if you acquire an area or you do an invasion tomorrow and then the ceasefire happens, you have that territory as an asset that you can give up in exchange for other things or keep and just annex. Because it all comes down to whenever the war pauses and stops, that amount of land is what Russia would either be demanding, or if they don't get that land, meaning their troops would have to retreat off of the land that they currently have, which would be in Ukraine, they would get something in return for the land that they're giving up in the form of Ukraine not joining NATO, Ukraine demilitarizing. It would be something like that. So it's all jousting sessions based on, the assets that you potentially could have. And that's why this war has really picked up over the last few weeks when it comes to the front line, or really the past few months. Honestly, ever since Trump won, when Biden authorized the longer range missile strikes, and Russia obviously saw that as an escalation. I think that was originally done to let Russia know that NATO was still behind Ukraine, even with Trump as president, and that they knew that a peace deal eventually was coming, and they wanted Russia to know that this is not a situation to where you can take advantage of Ukraine too much. But this is a situation to where it's important to understand there was an original ceasefire that was signed onto by Zelensky and not Putin. And then it became a partial ceasefire on infrastructure and energy that was signed by both Russia and also I think in relations to the Red Sea as well, which is beneath Crimea. And so that was signed by both Zelensky and Putin. You can see Trump saying, quote, "If Russia and I are unable to make a deal on stopping the bloodshed in Ukraine, and if I think that it was Russia's fault, which it might not be," so he leaves it out, it might not be Russia's fault, but if I think it's Russia's fault, I'm going to put secondary tariffs on oil and all oil coming out of Russia. And he says it will be a 25% tariff on all oil, 25 to 50% tariffs. The abrupt change of direction came after Putin had tried to attack the legitimacy of Volodymyr Zelensky on Friday, according to Trump. Appearing on Russian television, Putin suggested Ukraine could be placed under temporary UN-led government to organize fresh elections before negotiating a peace deal. So, what Putin is saying is he doesn't want to negotiate with Zelensky. I guess he thinks that Zelensky is acting in bad faith in these negotiations. Zelensky, who it does seem like he's a puppet of the European countries and NATO, obviously Putin does not like that. He would like someone a lot more pro-Russian to negotiate this peace deal that would give Russia significantly, whether it's more land or just a better environment in terms of whatever is negotiated. When it comes to the negotiation, I do think Russia has most of the leverage, but it is one of those. They have as much leverage as NATO allows them, in a sense, because if NATO wants to be very aggressive, they would lose a ton of leverage. But at that point, leverage becomes meaningless, because if you've got NATO direct involvement with Russia, then you're talking escalation, which is what we don't want. So NATO is trying to balance it to where they back Ukraine enough to give themselves a legitimate peace deal that doesn't cripple Ukraine for the foreseeable future. But you also don't want to go too hard at Russia, because then you're talking about escalation, which is something they've tried to avoid, even when you had a U.S. president that was completely supportive of Ukraine in the Biden administration. So this does seem like Trump is getting pissed off at Putin. And this whole ceasefire, it's dragged on now for multiple weeks. There was an original thought that we were going to get a ceasefire. Originally, we thought there was going to be a minerals deal. Then I talked yesterday about Zelensky saying, no, it was a grant, which he said about 2 months ago. He said it's a grant and that we don't have to pay back. Ukraine doesn't have to pay back the money, which there's estimates. They say it's 123 billion, 170 billion, whatever it is. It's well into the 9 figures in terms of what Ukraine would owe the United States as a repayment for the amount we've given them in military aid for this war. And so Zelensky said, well, no, now I'm going back on that. And the potential minerals deal we make with the United States, which, by the way, if you read up on that minerals deal, it did not include any security assurances, but it does tie the United States to the region, because there's going to have to be mining operations within those regions. And they said, no, we can't do this because this is going to affect our potential admission to the EU, which they really want to join, and they applied for it in 2022. They became a candidate in 2023. That's kind of the process with the EU. It's a multi-year thing to be able to join it, and they're not going to be joining it, I wouldn't imagine, during wartime. And even for the EU, that would be especially if this war ends, it would be very risky to admit them after this entire situation with Russia. But that's a European conflict. That's a European problem, not an American problem. So when it comes to this, there's problems with both Zelensky and Putin. Zelensky saying, no, we're not repaying anything. The only money we'll give you is for the stuff, from now on. So if we give them military aid from now on, that's what we're going to be getting back. But we'll see if a minerals deal ends up happening between the United States and Ukraine. I mean, for Ukraine, it would make sense to do a minerals deal. It might even be better for Ukraine in terms of being more beneficial towards them than the United States. But there were some things that came out about that minerals deal that said that the United States would have almost total control to their gas and oil, which they didn't like because it would affect them potentially joining the EU. But Trump is angry at Putin because Putin, he wants, at least seemingly, to delay this ceasefire for, it's unknown. I mean, you could speculate for how long until Russia gets into more, maybe an advantageous position to really cripple Ukraine. And also Russia wants to negotiate with someone who's more pro-Russian in terms of the Ukrainian leadership than Zelensky. And Trump is saying, well, that's not going to happen. And so, that's why you've kind of seen this Republican Russian talking point that Zelensky needs to be removed or he needs to hold elections because when it comes to a peace deal, someone like Zelensky, it's going to be hard because of, obviously he is trying to get the best deal for his country, which can also be an issue in terms of the amount of support he gets from those European countries within NATO. Because remember, they had the Istanbul talks in 2022, and Boris Johnson convinced him to not take the deal when he was going to take it, or it was at least getting close to being done. It was rumored. So, I mean, these European countries have already muddled with Zelensky, and they're in bed together, and so, they're bossing, you don't want to say they're bossing him around, but obviously there's huge influence from those European NATO countries on Ukraine and just how weak they are at this point in terms of their future. They need to have relationships with the United. I mean, that's why Zelensky, after getting thrown out of the White House, is like, I'm sorry, I apologize. Please, can we do this deal? They have to have relationships with the West if they want to continue as a country. And so I also think another sticking point when it comes to this peace deal is the demilitarization aspect of Ukraine, which is something that's going to be a big problem for Ukrainians. Obviously, after Russia did this invasion, they're not going to want that. And Putin wants that. So, and that was a hang up in their talks that they had in 2022, right after the war started. It was going to be a quick end to the war, but there were some snags in the peace talks or the negotiations. So Trump wants a total ceasefire, which then can beckon in a negotiating window, and Putin seemingly is delaying it. Now, there's a ceasefire on certain things, and I think Putin is trying to be like, well, he's trying to come off as agreeable, but he doesn't like Zelensky, obviously. He wants a more pro-Russian government in Ukraine. He wants there to be elections, whether or not you believe. I mean, Trump said that Zelensky had like a 4% approval rating. That was back like a month or two ago. That's not true, to be fair. But Zelensky's approval has gone down significantly in Ukraine. It was about 68, 69% when people galvanized around him back in 2023, and now it's about 50-50. So, I mean, when it comes to like elections after 3 years of war, I mean, it's kind of a crapshoot, honestly. But you could argue, yeah, he should have an election there, and it seems like Putin is trying to force that, but Trump doesn't like that. There's this major rift right now, and Putin seemingly is delaying this ceasefire, at least in several aspects, to where it's only been agreed upon the fighting in the Black Sea. There's a ceasefire on that, and there's a ceasefire on energy and infrastructure, but other than that, there's still wars going on. So Trump wants it to end. I think this is a pretty good look for Trump. I mean, we'll see what the actual angle is here from Trump in terms of threatening these tariffs on Russia, but it kind of dispels the whole. I mean, we're kind of already past the whole Trump and Russia stuff in terms of the collusion and everything like that, because it just doesn't matter anymore politically, because they said it back in 2017, 2018. They tried to get him impeached for it. It didn't work. And then, obviously Trump wins in 2024. But it's like, well, Trump is also being hard on Russia. If Putin is delaying this, if Putin is saying statements that are going to make a peace deal or a ceasefire harder to reach, Trump is not going to be too happy about that. Trump was put in office to end this war in Eastern Europe. He's trying to do that. Whether it's Russia or Ukraine, whoever is at fault, he's going to call them out and try and force repercussions on these countries if they don't want to come to the table and negotiate peace, because we're done with it. So, to me, this is a pretty good look for Trump, and he's playing hardball with both. This is what happens. I mean, if Putin is going to do this, whether we're not pro-Russia, we're not pro-Ukraine, we're trying to get the situation solved, get it ended. We understand that both countries are going to want certain things, they're going to have to give up certain things. That's just the reality of peace negotiations, and it is what it is. And both countries are angling to try and get the best amount of leverage before the hopefully the peace of negotiations that happen. You can't put a time frame on it. Hopefully by the summer, by the fall, it wouldn't even make sense for me. But hopefully very soon, because if Trump is threatening these tariffs, even if even if the tariffs don't destroy Russia, the thought would be that Putin would say, okay, we've got an American president who's at least not totally anti-Russia. I don't want to destroy my relationship with him over this. Let me come to the negotiating table. Let me at least work out a ceasefire. I think that would be the hope from Trump in terms of, look, we're not trying to be horribly mean to Russia. Let's just cooperate. Let's do this. You've been delaying the ceasefire. Let's get it done. Right? And again, we're not trying to have this terrible relationship. We're not saying you're the number one enemy like liberals are, but we have to get this done, and you're delaying this, and you're coming out and saying things about Zelensky and holding up these new elections and calling him illegitimate. It really puts a strain on relations in terms of both Russia and Ukraine communicating for peace. So I think Trump just wants there to be a peace deal. And if there's barriers in terms of Putin creating them to get to the peace deal, there's going to be the repercussions against Russia. And that's what Trump is saying. So we'll see what happens. But what I will say about it is, the next step is a full ceasefire, and then you get into a negotiating window. But this is just, it is what it is. It's politics. Trump is not happy that Putin is seemingly delaying a ceasefire. And remember, as Zelensky originally agreed to the ceasefire, the full ceasefire, Putin did not. And you're not biased. I know a lot of people that watch, you like Russia, you think Ukraine's illegitimate, they shouldn't exist, whatever. But at the end of the day, they do exist. We know what happened in 2014. The West manipulated the Ukrainians. They wanted Ukraine. It was a total encroachment and overstep by NATO. But this is just where we are right now. And if we're trying to get this done, and especially if there, Trump comes off as too pro-Russian, it's going to look very weak from an American perspective. So we have to understand that Trump is going to be hard on both Russia and Ukraine. And this is the situation, and Zelensky is in right now. And if you think he's illegitimate and you think they should have elections, they've been fighting for 3 years. I don't know what you want me to say. I mean, if they had elections, it's a crapshoot. I mean, they've lost population, but yeah, they should have more elections. I agree, but it's not this simple as just have them tomorrow. But obviously, Putin wants someone that's more pro-Russian. But either way, guys, that's just the current situation. Make sure you follow me on X. Link to that's always in the description.